Hello and welcome to Nick Loading In, my commentary channel. Alright folks, so Franke. Kevin filed another motion today against Jodi in the child custody case that's still ongoing. Brian Schnee from KUTV2 News Salt Lake City reported on it recently, and the document is up on their website. I'll include the link down below. That is what we're going to run through, and I'm going to weigh in on a few things as we go. First, everything in this video is alleged. It is my opinion and my speculation. I do encourage that everybody go and do their own research and formulate their own opinions, and as always, please do so respectfully. Okay, so I'm no lawyer. I've never practiced law. I've never studied law specifically, so I'm no expert. But I have followed this case since it broke, and there were just a couple things listed in this document that I wanted to touch on, so I'm also not going to go through the entire thing step by step. I am going to glaze over a few parts of it. So as I mentioned before, you can go down to the link and find your way to the document, which is available. I specifically am going through KUTV2 News. I'm sure there's going to be other news media outlets and things reporting on this soon enough, but that's the link I will include. So let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, so this first part is really just formalities, really. Where I'm going to start is getting in on the facts and general allegations. First, they list the 4 minor children of Kevin, and then we get into it here. While plaintiff was residing in Utah County beginning on or about May 22nd, 2023, defendant, Jodi, in collaboration with plaintiff's then wife, Ruby Franke, also mother of these 4 children, moved the 4 minor children to the defendant's home in Ivins, Utah. Neither defendant nor Ruby Franke advised plaintiff of their removal of the children from the family home in Springville, Utah, to defendant's home in Ivins. So, much like I kind of talked about in my most recent video with the pen papers and the move and everything like that, I talked about how Kevin, Jodi and Ruby had to have had some type of contingency plan or something to curtail him because it seemed very clear that he had no idea. And this further just kind of proves that he had no idea the kids weren't even in Springville. So I also discussed in that video a little bit about how maybe there was reasons for his complacency, and I touched on the fact that his complacency was probably because he thought the kids were right down the street. He had no idea they were 4 hours away in Ivins, you know? And I mean, I get it. He could have checked on them and everything. We'll touch on that in a little bit. I understand that, but I want to kind of just bring some comparisons to light towards that. But again, we'll get to it in a moment. For the period of time, May 22nd through August 30th, 2023, while at the defendant's home, defendant did intentionally and or recklessly and or negligently wrongfully detained plaintiff's 2 minor children, RF and EF, then ages 11 and 9, often confining them to a room in the home and or basement of the home from which they were not allowed to leave without permission of the defendant or Ruby Franke. Further, these children were strictly prohibited from leaving the premises of the Ivins home under threat of further or increased punishment described hereinafter, or going to jail. These kids, they being coerced and brainwashed and living in constant fear, right? You can't leave, you're going to go to jail, or we're going to continue to make these punishments even worse, which, as we continue to read through this and as we've heard from Ruby's journals directly, it's horrible. Inflicted and allowed another adult to inflict serious physical injuries upon the 2 children in her residence. The defendant committed physical torture of RF, who was forced to do physical tasks for hours and days at a time. These included wall sits, carrying boxes full of books up and down the stairs, and working outside. RF was forced to do outside labor without shoes and in the summer heat in southern Utah. He's forced to stand in the direct sunlight for several days. He is forced to remain outside at all hours of the day and night for extended periods of time. These actions resulted in repeated and serious sunburns with blistered and sloughing skin. RF was also denied adequate water several of the days he was required to remain in the summer heat, and was punished when he secretly consumed water. Okay, so I can actually speak from personal experience how freaking hot Utah is in the summer. Kind of an eerie circumstance for me. My girlfriend and I, we live in Florida, but we're out here for family things, and we're from like Washington and Oregon, so the West Coast. So every summer we take a trip back west. We block out like a month of at a time. We use all our vacation and we make the drive back. We have now three dogs. We've always had one. We had two at the end of the summer before last. So we make the drive. We don't fly. Well, it's a long drive. It's a day and 17 hours. So most of the time, we're so excited to get back west, see our friends, our family, and everything. We just kind of bomb it up there. Well, this last summer, I decided let's make a trip out of this. Let's have some fun. And I've always been fascinated with the wilderness and the nature and the landscape of Utah, that and Colorado. And those are two places that have always kind of been on my bucket list. And we drive pretty much right through that area when we make our trip up. So I was like, let's see what places we can stop off in Utah with the dogs. And like originally I was looking at like Zion and all of that, but they're very restrictive to where we can bring animals and really enjoy our time with them. So I started kind of curtailing my searches, and I stumbled upon St. George, and I stumbled upon Sand Hollow Reservoir. So we ended up planning our trip up around staying a night in St. George. This was around July 17th and 18th. Okay. Which is, like I said, it's really disturbing to me because Sand Hollow and where we were kind of staying in St. George is 24 miles away from where these kids were. This would have been 3 days after he made his first attempt to run away. Yeah, it's chilling for me. But anyways, I remember distinctly. Now, Florida is humid and I freaking hate the humidity here. It is not for me. But I remember when we got into Utah, it was hotter than hell. I mean, 120 degrees, and that's no exaggeration. 120 degrees. We had no freaking cold water in the hotel. Like there was no cold water in the hotel. I had to pick my dogs up and carry them across the sand down to the water's edge so they didn't burn their paws. It is fucking hot. It is a dry heat, so I personally was like, "Oh, this is great compared to the humidity." But when you touch that fucking pavement, it is horrible. So when I think about what these kids were going through, having to walk barefoot in that heat, stand outside in that heat, we're lucky that RF is alive. Just had to add that in there. RF was denied sufficient food and when given food, he was given very plain meals, rice and chicken, while others in the house regularly ate and a more flavorful meal. RF was isolated from other people and denied all forms of entertainment, including books, notebooks, and electronics. In July, RF attempted to run away from the compound. When he was caught by the defendant and Ruby, he was taken home, and his hands and feet thereafter were regularly bound, including being tied to multiple weights. Many times, the binding included two sets of handcuffs, as one on his wrists and one on his ankles. So, first of all, the part where they're talking about how RF was often isolated, like they're kind of specifically pinpointing him. And even in one of the journal entries, I believe it was talked about how RF got like still like chicken and plain meal, but his sister EF was able to get like a steak and mashed potatoes. So to me, I've always kind of wondered and speculated that this was the case, but it seems to lay it out a little bit more clearly here that RF was probably getting more intense treatment in certain regards because he was a young male. And I'm sure that given Jodi and Ruby at first both said that he shouldn't be, or I guess they shouldn't, but he shouldn't be around the other children. She was inflicting and imposing this idea that he was a sexual deviant at the age of freaking 11 years old. I guarantee it. That's my opinion, but I guarantee it, man. Also, I know we know a lot of the treatment that because we've all been through the Ruby Franke journals when they first released a little while back. So I know that this was already kind of mentioned, I believe. So I know we're kind of revisiting some rather traumatic pieces. But when I read that part where it says that he was regularly bound, including being tied to weights, I went through the evidence photos, like I said, and looking back, I remember seeing these photos and being like, those weights, those kettlebells, those were used for the kids. But now having that written out plain as day, you know, I don't know, it breaks my heart, man. It breaks my heart what these kids went through. It's listen, if you guys have watched ABC's 2020, then they do show one of the photos, undoctored, uncensored, in the case release of the evidence photos. They are also available, and it shows both his legs and his hands, or his wrists. They are. It's it's a lot. It's a lot to look at, and if this is a sensitive topic for you, I wouldn't. I wouldn't. But they're horrible, and so knowing that he was stuck in this hogtied. I mean, I just. And I understand that Ruby is just as culpable for allowing these kids to go through this, but we are going to touch a little bit further on why Jodi is the monster. The monster. Both the children were present in the home and saw these actions taking place against each of them by the defendant and Ruby Franke. In other ways, the defendant caused severe emotional harm to RF and EF. Other than binding and specific instances of abuse RF was subjected to, EF was subjected to the same treatment as RF. She was isolated and forced to do extreme and demanding physical tasks, ran outside, and denied inadequate water and food. EF was told that these punishments were necessary for her to be obedient and to force her to repent, and were being done to her in order to help her. She was indoctrinated with the idea that the defendant's extreme abusive behaviors towards her were in fact acts of love. EF was also repeatedly told she was evil and possessed. The statements to her by the defendant and Ruby convinced EF that she was evil and needed to go through these things in order to repent. EF was further forced to work outside in the heat barefoot. She was forced to run barefoot on dirt roads for an extended period of time, repeatedly injuring and sunburning her feet. When examined by medical professionals on the 30th of August, these wounds were apparent by scabs, blisters, and sloughing of the skin. EF was physically forced or coerced to jump into a cactus multiple times. I mean, thank God. Thank God these kids were never taken to Arizona. I said it before. These kids wouldn't have made it. Honestly, I believe it's an absolute miracle they even made it through this. Holy shit. On or about August 30th, 2023, RF was eventually able to escape from the defendant's home and contacted a neighbor. RF requested from the neighbor food, water, and that law enforcement be called so he could be taken to jail. This latter request was because he had been so indoctrinated by defendant that if he escaped, he would go to jail. And it goes into instead of jail, however, obviously they responded. I'm going to kind of skip through some of the rest of this. She was arrested at her home, searching, so they found EF. We know it took forever to get them out of there. Jump back in here. What's listed prior. The state of Utah, through the Department of Child and Services, took custody of all 4 of the plaintiff's children in order to address professionally the emotional and psychological condition of the children, which had been so seriously and adversely manipulated and indoctrinated. The children are residing in separate homes while in state custody. So I found that interesting because I think, I thought at one point I had heard that the 2 youngest children were together and the 2 middle children were together, but from the sounds of this, they're all separate. They're all in different homes. We did hear that they're doing better, but it's clear that there's a lot of healing ahead for these 2, right? And hopefully they can make it through all of it, and I don't think that saying they'll be okay is the right word, but they'll survive, I guess. The children's personalities, emotions, and psyches were so damaged and altered that it was beyond the father's capability to restore them without professional intervention of the state's resources through the juvenile court. This through a rehabilitation and restorative process directed and prescribed by the professionals treating the children. In order to restore his children to his care in their family, father himself has complied with the court process and has affirmatively sought his own regimen of professional therapy in order to coordinate not only with the children's treatment providers, but to gain an understanding of the children's conditions and needs and how to best facilitate the restoration of all his children back to their former status as happy and healthy individuals and of a happy and intact family in their family home. I know there's a lot of controversy surrounding Kevin. A lot of people still, to this point, can't understand how a father could be so absent and like not attempt to check in or break any of these supposed rules. But I feel like it's only fair to hold Kevin in the same light as these other victims of Jodi's from the past, right? We know Adam Steed's story, which I'm going to release a video pretty much right after this, going over some stuff from Adam's time and everything. But we in his case, his wife was completely manipulated against him, full blown, 100% believed everything that came out of Jodi's mouth about Adam to the point where it destroyed his life. It destroyed his life. His kids were taken away. His wife divorced him. He was kicked out of BYU. I mean, he lost his church membership for a while. It was destroyed. You got to remember that Jodi is a therapist. A therapist holds an obscene amount of power over their clients simply because their clients tend to come to them and tell them their deepest, darkest secrets. Like they hold nothing back often with their therapist. Their therapist is going to know more about their dirty laundry than probably anybody else in their life. And now you got to think about somebody like Jodi, who has a long history, a long rap sheet of abusing this power and this responsibility that she has in the position that she holds professionally. I'm sure there had to have been some fear of what she would do, and who knows if there was threats being made in that regard. She was obviously very good at manipulation, so I'm sure Kevin, in his mind, he's living in fear in his own way, because anything that he does that goes against what he's being told he's allowed to do, basically because of Jodi's control over his wife at the time, he doesn't want to risk never getting his family back. In his mind, he's thinking, we get through this and then everything's going to be okay. He even expresses that in one of his interviews. So I feel like there has to be a little bit of grace, understanding the circumstances. Look at people who fall into cults. Look, they're perfectly good people, and it takes them forever to wake up sometimes and realize, holy shit. And it also is important to note that most of the time, when you have manipulation, you have elements of control. And oftentimes, elements of control are withholding specific information from an individual to coerce them and control them in the way that you want to. So Kevin has mentioned that he never heard anything directly from Ruby about his children, but he's constantly hearing from Jodi, his therapist, that everything's fine, it's better that you're not here, things are going well. He's being lied to and kept in the dark. It's an awful long time, and I don't know that I would ever have that patience being put on that leash and isolated in that regard. I don't know, but he's not me and I'm not him. I didn't live that. He did. And he appears to be trying to do what he can now to fix something. And the amount of guilt that he's also wrestling with has to be astronomical, because I just don't see Kevin as a bad guy. People disagree with how Mormons parent their children, and most of everything leading up before like the 2021 kind of shit where things started really taking a hard right with the lunch and everything, those things were, yeah, a little bit too intense, but most of everything else that was happening is well within the accepted form of parenting within Mormons. It's very strict, it's very restrictive, it's very controlling. The stuff that happened in Jodi's home and that followed after they removed Kevin. And that's also, you got to think that there's a reason why. I mean, sure, she didn't like men or whatever, and you can hypothesize to her weird relationship with Ruby, all of that shit. But I also think that it has something to do with the fact that Kevin was pushing back, because he pushed back over the channel. When Jodi was trying to take over 8 passengers, he pushed back, and that caused further tension. And eventually, he stated in his second interview that's basically what led to the separation, like the full-blown separation. So I may not win a bunch of kudo points for standing up for Kevin, but it's my opinion. That's how I feel looking over everything. And even the people who have remarked on his body language, the police, they, you know, should he and could he have done more? Yeah, most definitely. But I don't think that he should be condemned as the worst fucking father in the world, because I think that the worst fucking father in the world would have been standing right beside all of this happening. He trusted his wife. He didn't have any reason to not. He didn't have any reason to believe that Ruby would be capable of these things. I think that's why he filed for divorce so quickly as well, once he learned the severity of the situation. Anyways, I'll get off my high horse on that. The intentional and or negligent acts of the defendant have completely damaged, altered for the worse Kevin's marriage. The children's mother is in prison. Don't mean to laugh there, but all of his children's individual psyches, personalities, and behaviors, essentially dismantling, exploding his family and his personal life. So these are the cause of actions, basically why he's filing this. Defendant engaged in severe and intolerable conduct as set forth in this complaint. Defendant acted with reckless disregard of the possibility of causing emotional distress to Kevin and to each of Kevin's children. Kevin suffered severe and or extreme emotional distress that was caused by the defendant's conduct as a direct and proximate result of defendant's wrongful actions and omissions. Kevin has suffered past and future economic, non-economic damages, pain and suffering, emotional distress, loss of quality of life, and loss of enjoyment of life. I understand that people are going to be like, well, fuck you, Kevin. You weren't around, so why are you even trying to file for anything for yourself? Again, let's try to have a little bit of grace. His wife's in jail. He spent 1.5 years almost, was just like completely isolated, being completely tortured mentally and emotionally himself, you know, completely manipulated. And then he finds out that his wife abused the living shit out of his children. You got to consider as well that he's going to try to sink as much money as possible, because their whole livelihood has been ruined. He mentions in a call with Ruby, a jail call, that he's not even at BYU. So I'm not sure what kind of other work he's doing. His reputation and name is pretty tainted because of this being a national thing. I mean, I feel like he's trying to get as much as he can back for his children. And since he can't physically go make an example out of this lady, he's got to take her money. Second cause of action. Defendant engaged in conduct that she should have realized involved an unreasonable risk of causing emotional distress to the children, Kevin, and others. Defendant knew or should have known that her conduct could cause the sort of emotional distress that might result in illness or bodily harm or injury. Defendant's conduct unintentionally caused Kevin to sustain severe emotional distress characterized by illness or bodily harm or injury. That part's interesting to me, because I wonder if it's referencing that maybe he was struggling with some dark stuff while in isolation, and then further dark stuff now coming out of that isolation, coming out of all of this crazy brainwashing and realizing what has happened and what he should have been able to stop but wasn't around to stop, you know? Like, yeah, I just interesting statement and what it potentially alludes to. That's just my speculation. Third cause of action. Defendant undertook duties and responsibilities with regard to Kevin and the minor children and engaged in conduct, all of which imposed upon her a legal duty to act reasonably and within the scope of acceptable behavior in her actions with Kevin and the children. Defendant, as detailed in the statement of facts, breached her duty of care and reasonable behavior and conduct. Defendant's breaches of duty, negligence, caused Kevin economic and non-economic damages as may be established upon proof of trial and to include pain and suffering, emotional distress, loss of quality of life, and loss of enjoyment of life. So that last little section, as far as like how I would summarize it, is basically saying, you know, as a professional therapist and acting in a professional capacity, Jodi was bound to legalities of how she should conduct herself, that she willingly undertook the family as a client or clients, and in doing so, she had a legal duty to fulfill in a way, right? Like she was responsible as a licensed therapist and mental health provider. And that is why there are guidelines, and that is why there is the board of ethics. It's there and designed as a avenue of recourse, yes, for clients, but it's also meant to keep these therapists in check and make sure that they're wielding their power and their position appropriately. And this would be why I'm so harsh on Jodi, and I hold a little bit more grace for the Frankies. Jodi has abused her power and her role from the moment she began her career. As far as I'm concerned, she has never once used her position for good. That's my opinion, but I think it speaks for itself as well. And because of the position that she held and how she chose to weaponize her said position, I think that she was able to manipulate people who I don't think would have been manipulated in quite the same way. I think that that title gave her a lot more power, and power that she was never meant to hold, have, or wield. Anyways, we were basically at the end of the docket anyway, so I'm just going to go ahead and leave it here. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I'm going to be putting another video out probably tomorrow that's taking a look at Jodi and how I think she could have and absolutely should have been stopped well prior to ever meeting the Franke family, and how her pattern of abuse and manipulation and control never changes basically for her entire 15 to 20 year career. But until then, stay safe, be kind, and I'll see you soon.